Monday, January 19th, 1959. I came home from school dead tired and fell asleep. The phone woke me up at 6 p.m. It was somebody or other most politely inviting me to appear before the Charlie Johns Committee right away. I went, and they were busy for about an hour, and then my ordeal began. After about an hour and a half, they were through with me, and my life work was in shambles. I was guilty of not measuring up to what I was supposed to have been. I carried my secret, I thought, well concealed. Oh, but why to burden you with all this nonsense? Maybe you don't even want to read the rest, knowing now the scarlet letter branded upon me.
We feel that there's no doubt communist people are behind a lot of this race agitation, and that we hope that we can stop it if that's possible, let the people know just what's what, and we're going to let the chips fall where they may.
During the 1950s, many white Southerners feared that communists were conspiring with blacks to end white supremacy. The United States Supreme Court's 1954 Brown versus the Board of Education decision, making segregation illegal, only intensified those concerns.
My present inclination is to call an extraordinary session of the Florida legislature to cope with this ruling.
In the mid-1950s, Florida lawmakers like Charlie Johns only had to look out their office windows in the state capitol to see what they believed to be the hand of communist agitators. Blacks in Florida, like others throughout the South, had taken to the streets to boycott segregated bus service.
During the activities that took place, the Tallahassee bus system basically is put into bankruptcy. What begins to happen then is that the legislature thinks it's time to act. And in August of 1956, they go into special session to deal with the issue of segregation. One of the things that came out of this session was the creation of a committee called the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee.
Conservative Northern Florida lawmakers were nicknamed pork choppers by newspaper reporters because they were good at bringing home the bacon in the budget to their respective districts.
They didn't want to put a lot of money into the growing urban areas of the peninsula. They didn't want to expand higher education opportunities. They also wanted to maintain certain customs and traditions, such as segregation. And anybody who questioned those types of activities jeopardized their political career.
One of the most influential pork choppers was State Senator Charlie Johns, a railroad conductor and banker from Bradford County. Johns had been Senate president and became acting governor in 1953 when Governor Dan McCarty died in office. Johns served as governor for less than a year. He ran unsuccessfully in 1954 against fellow state senator Leroy Collins.
My record in the legislature is an open book. I have always represented the little man in the state legislature.
After losing to Collins, Johns returned to the state Senate, hoping to propel himself back into power. His vehicle was the Florida Legislative Investigation Committee, which would soon become known as the Johns Committee.
During the late 1956 and early 1957 period, what the committee does is it tries to associate the activities of integrationist groups, especially the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP, with some type of a communist conspiracy, basically trying to say that by questioning the social arrangement of segregation, you are violating the laws of Florida.
The committee began to hold hearings around the state, the bulk of them in Miami. Charlie Johns questioned blacks about their involvement with the NAACP, but the NAACP refused to cooperate.
I want to say that the way the witnesses defied our legislative committee when we was down at Miami was simply ridiculous, and I feel this committee should go back down there and call those witnesses before us to testify, and if they refuse, we should put them in jail and let them stay there.
The committee's attempt to intimidate blacks in Miami had failed. Now Charlie Johns would find a new target.
Looking back at it all, I just smile a bittersweet smile. But while I was living under it, it was not easy. I shuddered whenever the phone rang, but I threw myself into my work. I don't think I gave better lectures in my life. The intensity of imminent disaster seemed to sharpen my wits. I wrote some of the nicest and some of my dearest letters. Feverishly, I tried to finish everything.
Gainesville is a university town and proud of its close relationship with the Southeast's largest institution of higher learning, the University of Florida.
Charlie Johns believed he'd found the state's greatest threat at the University of Florida.
So then I guess they decided that all homosexuals must be communists or something like that. And Mr. Johns, Senator Johns from Bradford County, had the idea that they would go after the universities because that's what might be the quote-unquote hotbed of homosexuality.
In the summer of 1958, Johns told Chief Investigator Remus J. Strickland to look into alleged homosexual activity on the University of Florida campus. He hoped the findings would convince lawmakers to extend the committee's funding and power.
I heard people were telling me that they were allowing the university police to come and take professors out of the classroom, which I couldn't believe that was happening.
The committee hired University of Florida police officers to help them investigate and interrogate witnesses.
In those days, that was before Miranda, and it was not necessary to advise anybody of their rights, so nobody was really given their rights. They were just asked to come to the police department. They really were asked in such a way that they really didn't have much of a choice.
Here's a scenario of what might have happened. Somebody who is known to be an employee of the university, maybe a professor, might have went down to the Alachua County Courthouse to use the restroom while he was downtown on business. If he was in the restroom stall for a period that was considered too long by one of the surveillance members of the Johns Committee, he might be called in for questioning. Others were called in for questioning based upon the clothes that they wore, sometimes based upon what students said about the instructors, that they thought the instructor was not acting normal.
This is an unfortunate impulse that comes on you, and I don't know what stimulus. And then you have to, well, relieve yourself if you do, and quite often you don't, and it goes away, and that's that. I knew this was bound to happen sooner or later.
There's a personal dimension to a lot of what happens. There's a professor at the University of Florida who had been the chair of the geography department since the mid-1940s named Sigmund Diettrich. Dietrich was well known throughout the academic community, well respected at the University of Florida. He was called before the committee because he had, according to one professor, was known to tap his foot when he went into the men's room stall. Well, after the committee had interrogated him and basically left the man in shambles, they told him to act normal as ever.
I had to execute my plan. I went over to the church, and in my blind arrogance I argued with God that killing myself is a necessity and cannot be a sin. This settled, I went out to school. I had the aspirin there. I took 85 of the damn pills and met my class. When I finished, I ran upstairs. I climbed up and looked down on the cold, wet concrete sidewalk. I turned yellow. I could not jump. The aspirin started to act. It dulled my senses. I went back to the office. I got home somehow.
A few hours before Diettrich attempted suicide, University of Florida President J. Wayne Wrights met with him. Diettrich described the meeting as the 20 minutes that finished my life. Wrights forced him to resign.
Gainesville, Florida, a friendly city of over 50,000, where the key to good living hangs on everybody's key ring. Located in north-central Florida, the city enjoys the state's mild climate. Yet, seasonal changes are apparent, and each spring it is one immense bouquet.
In the spring of 1959, many faculty members at the University of Florida were aware of the Johns Committee's investigations, but were careful about how they discussed it.
Of course, there was a certain amount of talk about who is being fired and who is being terminated, and the joke was that if you were going to quit anyhow this spring, don't, because people will feel that you're going on this account.
UF President J. Wayne Wrights took office in 1955. The same year, Charlie Johns returned to the state Senate. The two men corresponded through letters before the Johns Committee investigations began on campus. Johns often sent notes of gratitude to Wrights for letting him park in his driveway during University of Florida football games. Once the investigations had begun, Wrights and the administration began feeling pressure from Johns and his committee to cooperate.
When Charlie Johns or one of his representatives called up President Wayne Wrights and said, "We're coming down to investigate," you didn't have a lot of opportunity if you were President Wrights to say, "I don't think so, we have principles of academic freedom to uphold." Because if you were to raise a lot of cane about that, you might find your budget very seriously harmed in the next legislative session.
But some faculty felt Wrights could have done more to guard the university faculty and students.
As the president of a university, I think it was his responsibility and his duty to his students and faculty to protect them against unwarranted invasions of their civil rights. Forget academic freedom. Just call them their free speech, their civil rights, their human rights, their equal protection.
Being administrators within the state law, we had no alternative except to counsel these people and counsel some of them out of the university.
In a letter to Wrights, Charlie Johns praised the University of Florida president for, in his words, all the dirty work that had to be done on campus. Wrights, fearful of public perception, claimed that the majority of the faculty members terminated from the university had been on staff prior to him becoming president. Wrights also wrote that he intended to pay careful attention to the moral character of future applicants.
As a matter of fact, I'll be the first to admit that I thought that anyone who was a homosexual was a complete aberration.
Gainesville has definite advantages for both industry and residents. Local young people can get top-quality college education living right at home. Just being a college community makes a youthful, vigorous atmosphere.
The Johns Committee also went after University of Florida students. Because of the committee's allegations, more than 50 were expelled.
First semester I started on my 25th birthday. The first year was very uneventful. The early classes are fairly simple and fairly easy. I was, because I'd been in service first, I was 4 years older than most of my classmates. I was standing with some friends in the Burger House, which is right on University Avenue across from my dormitory, chatting and having a few beers. And during the course of the evening, one fellow came up to me and nudged me, and I think he took me aside and whispered in my ear. He pointed out a man sitting at the bar, and he said, "Watch out for that guy. He, I think, is some sort of government investigator." I didn't know what the investigation was about. All I had to hear were those words, and the terror began. The bay window up here on the second floor was my room. I used to sit up there and watch for Copleston. Basically, we spent most of our time in the dorms because we were afraid to leave. Copleston used to hang out in the hallway here, right here on the second landing. I ran into him many times. I don't know what he expected to find.
If I was looking at it through the eyes and ears of a suspect, I think they would have perceived it as a very grim atmosphere, like they've been trapped. They were never offered even a glass of water. They were told they had very little choice but to talk about this. If in fact they didn't, it was going to become public knowledge because they were going to be arrested and charged.
Walking across campus that day, I was fully prepared to hear the dean tell me that I was terminated from school. The dean asked me to close the door behind me, which again was terrifying. And he looked at me with a very, very somber look on his face, and he said, "I'm sorry to tell you I have some bad news." and he paused, and again my heart was pounding. He said, "Your father died this morning." I remember standing there thinking, oh, thank God, that's all it is. And I had just a tremendous sense of relief. My father was dead, but my life wasn't ending.
Investigators paid closest attention to homosexual men because they were seen as sexual predators trying to lure young people into homosexuality.
They were concerned about homosexuals, homosexual men. And so that's where most of the press was, that's where most of the attention was. But that doesn't mean that women, either lesbians didn't exist, or it didn't mean that they didn't face problems, and some problems which were unique to lesbians.
First of all, they pull out very personal, private things that nobody has the right to know, never mind these total strangers. And then they seat you in such a way that they can loom over you and be really physically menacing. And then they make all of these threats, you know, the life-ruining, family-ruining threats.
The Johns Committee had set its sights chiefly on the University of Florida, the state's largest school. However, investigators also searched for homosexuals at the other state universities. Julia Penelope was a student at Florida State University. She and Merril Mushroom were lovers at the time.
I was terrified for Julia while it was happening because everybody knew she was a dyke. You know, she was so out, I was terrified for her.
I knew what was going on in Gainesville, and I suspect everyone else did too. But we went to Miami, we had spring break. Merril said, they'll be waiting at FSU for you. And they were, and they started hauling students out of classes.
Most students never realized the extent of terror their classmates faced.
I was terrified. I think it was the first time I realized that I could be stepped on like I was a bug. And I was pulled out of a history class. Except I didn't see the Johns Committee. I was called to the Dean of Women's office. And I was, you know, given the option of going to see the school psychiatrist to be cured. And then I could stay. But then other things began to happen. Yeah, they were going to let me stay in school, but they were going to pick my roommate, someone, the dean said, who was not susceptible.
I think there was a lot of probably misunderstanding. Those that were knowledgeable, there would be a small percentage who would see this as a very serious issue. There would be another percentage who would probably say, you know, it's sad, laughable, but sad, but it doesn't really affect my life day in, day out.
Art Copleston was a dorm advisor on campus. No one knew what he was going through.
I had no backup. I had nowhere to turn. I was strictly out there on my own. I had a secret that I had to protect at all costs, and I couldn't turn to anyone for help. That was the terror that was set up.
The Johns Committee kept tabs on hundreds of students at the University of Florida. Investigators asked Merril Mushroom to be an informant for the committee. They never discovered that Merril herself was a lesbian.
They started telling me about they're trying to help these people and that there are all these homos on campus, and some of them are students and some of them are faculty, and they're really very sick people and they need our help. And God, I wanted to throw up. It took me about 4 hours after that to decide that I was going to transfer to the University of Miami, like instantly at the end of the semester, because this was too scary and too nasty and too awful and too horrible.
Florida State University gave Julia the option of transferring to the University of Miami or being expelled. Julia chose Miami. The students who were forced to leave the University of Florida were not forgotten by their fellow classmates. The university's 1959 yearbook had a special dedication page, dedicated to those many students who for some reason leave the University of Florida never to return. The many tragedies at the university this year will never be forgotten or fully understood.
The entire state has to be embarrassed by what was produced in January 1964.
After spending 9 years investigating, the committee released a pamphlet entitled Homosexuality and Citizenship in Florida.
They had positioned cameras in the men's rooms and had taken pictures in the men's rooms. And these are some, in fact, you see some of those in what we now call the infamous purple pamphlets. And I understand that it was selling as pornographic literature on the streets of New York in short order. And then it was quickly withdrawn. It wasn't widely circulated.
Support for the committee dwindled after the publication of the purple pamphlet.
This booklet was published and is presented to authorized people with the hope that it will better inform them as to the scope of homosexuality and the nature of it in the state of Florida. The printed matter on the final page of the book has been widely misunderstood and misinterpreted throughout the state.
Charlie Johns resigned from the committee, and R.J. Strickland left his position as chief investigator. Lawmakers also began to withdraw their support for the committee's renewal.
I think the members of the committee are dedicated men and have striven to do a good job, but from the remarks that I've heard from members of the Senate, I feel that the reactivation of the committee is questionable.
When it was all over, more than 100 university professors and public school teachers lost their jobs. Hundreds of students were forced to leave university campuses. Johns retired from the state senate in 1966 and returned to the banking business in his hometown of Stark. Before his death in 1990, Johns said he didn't want to be known as the Charlie Johns of the Johns Committee, but he also said he was proud of the committee's work. In his words, if the investigation saved one child from being made homosexual, it was justified.
I think that Charlie Johns did this not to save Florida's children, but to save the political career of himself and of other pork choppers. Charlie Johns left the committee after the uproar over the purple pamphlet really reached its crescendo. He realized that this was not the committee that he had started. Also, with the passage of the Federal Civil Rights Act in 1964, making attempts to preserve segregation a moot point, Johns realized that the committee had outlived its usefulness.
The overwhelming feeling that comes from something like that is an ingrained feeling of being less than satisfactory, being substandard, being not as good as straight people. I didn't feel this way before I met Mr. Copleston that night at the Burger House, ever. And I've felt this way ever since.
I can't say that I ever regretted anything I've ever done professionally. I worked very hard for 32 years in my profession. There were some things I would have liked to have changed, but I was not in any position to change those things, that being one of them.
It certainly taught me a tremendous amount about ways that people in power behave, and ways that people who I always had been taught were my friends are in fact my enemies.
No one should have the right to do that to another human being, much less hundreds of them. Most people in the United States don't even know what happened. I say the Johns Committee and the what? You know, and then I have to explain about this power-hungry redneck.
The balance sheet is simple. I've lost it all. All I lived for in my proud vanity, but I gained infinitely more in the love and proved devotion of my family, my co-workers, my friends, and my students. No money can buy that. I feel richer than gold. Now you've heard my Calvary in passion. I'm in the dock with bowed head, awaiting the verdict.